Good morning.
Good morning.
Today we're going to be looking at a story in the book of Genesis. So, what I would like all of you to do is please open up your Bible to Genesis 22. When you find Genesis 22, I would like you to stand. And you're going to read it in your head as I read it out loud. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to the young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hands the fire and the knife. And so they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. And when they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For I now know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and as the sands of on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. Dear God, thank you so much that we get to be here today in this time to worship you, in this time to humbly approach your word, God. Not for our own intentions, not for our own glory, God, but just so that we can learn you more, God, and that we may learn how to surrender ourselves more to you through what you have said to us. I just pray for every heart in this room, God, that all the stresses and worries of this week would be left behind as we enter in this time of fellowship together, where we get to explore and seek you. In your powerful name, amen. You can all be seated. The year is 1965. The month was November. It was in the evening as 31-year-old named Norman Morrison, who was a Quaker and a pacifist, was standing outside of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Norman Morrison, at this time in the evening, did the unthinkable. He drenched himself in kerosene and lit himself on fire. The fire raised up 12 feet in the sky all around him. A blanket of fire was surrounding him. And it grew intenser and intenser. Witnesses who heard it described the fire as the sound of a whoosh of a small rocket. But the worst part of all is that Norman Morrison, in his arms, held his own baby, who was less than a year old. Her name was Emily. People in the Pentagon who had seen it rushed outside. People passing by in their cars stopped and got out of their cars to run over and tell him to please put down the child. They say, drop the baby. See, Norman Morrison was a man that we said was a Quaker and a pacifist. And he had been haunted by the Vietnam War that had been going on at that time. Every day he would say to his wife, how can they go on like this? How can we do something to stop this? And that morning, the morning of his final day, Morrison had been reading a magazine in which an article had been talking about a village in Vietnam that had just been bombed by the U.S. And in the magazine there were pictures of the burnt corpses of women and children burnt by the napalm. And he couldn't handle it. So he borrowed his friend's old Cadillac and put a gallon jug of kerosene into his trunk. And he put his daughter, Emily, in her car seat. And he drove from Baltimore to Washington. And on the way from Baltimore to Washington, he stopped to mail one letter to his wife. And it reads as following. Dear Annie, this morning, without warning, I was shown clearly what I must do. Know that I love thee, but most of all act for the children of the village. And like Abraham, I dare not go without Emily. In the midst of this scene on the Pentagon, as everyone is rushing up and saying, drop the baby, let her go, Morrison decides in his final act to stretch out his arms and set her aside. And although Morrison died on the spot, that night police came and gave Emily back to her mother. She was unharmed and unsinged, although she still smelled like kerosene. Norman gave his life, and nearly his daughter's life as well, because he believed that God called him to sacrifice it in order to persuade people to stop the Vietnam War. And we have to ask, would God really ask someone to sacrifice the life of their own child? How could a loving parent even consider the idea of following such actions? Like many of you, when hearing about the story of Abraham in the Bible, it's disturbed me for many years. Because even if God didn't intend to have Abraham go through with it, the fact that he asked Abraham to sacrifice his own child is a very hard thing to swallow. This text can be very uncomfortable. It can be very dark. And yet, at its foundation, this story, by many scholars, is considered to be one of the most profound and important stories in the entire Bible. One of the most important events in history. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all look back at versions of this story. Versions of Abraham and his devotion despite such horrific circumstances. And today I want us to dive in and really walk through Abraham's shoes as he goes through this. And so the best way to do that is we're going to take a second to understand things from his perspective. I'm going to start by going through here. And if you guys will look at the first verse of Genesis 22, it says, "After these things God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here am I.'" And it goes on, but the first thing it says is after these things. After what things? Abraham in his life had been called to leave his father's house, to leave all of the family, all the people he had behind, way back in Genesis 12. And Abraham took his wife and they took off to this land of Canaan. The land of Canaan that he took off to would be later known to the people of Moses' time as the Promised Land. And to our time, it's what we would call Israel. And Abraham was asked to take off from his father's land in Haran to go to this land of Canaan with his wife. And God said, "If you do this, I will bless your offspring, and you will have a great nation." And so God promised Abraham and he promised Sarai that they would have a child. And they were old by the time that this promise actually came through. So old that Isaac, his name in the original language, means laughter. Because they were laughing at the fact that they never expected in these late years to have a child. And I'm sure his name was also laughter because of the joy that he brought them every day. And Abraham knew that after 25 years of waiting for God to fulfill his promise to give them a child, this kid was here, and he was the one that God said, "I am going to work through." Now, to our culture, in America at least, sometimes we don't necessarily consider what a child meant in the same way that their culture understood it. In their culture, the highest thing you can aspire to would be to have a great, strong family with kids who would also produce more offspring. Offspring and their success in life was how you define the success in your own life. Today we dream about money, cars, things like that. To them, their dreams were for their kids to be successful. And that's where all of their devotion was to. And so when we see that Abraham has this son that he's been waiting for 25 years, and they name him Laughter, he is also the representation of all of Abraham's hopes and dreams. But that's not the only thing that this story comes after. While Abraham was traveling through Canaan, along the way, he saw the people who are already there, the Canaanites. And while he was making altars to our God, he would see them worshiping their idols. And it was not uncommon at all for the pagan worship of their idols to include burnt child sacrifice. And so as he was going through the land with his family, he would see that in general most gods would require child sacrifice. And so one day when his God says to him, one night when his God shows up to him and says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you." It would have been one of the most conflicting situations in his entire life. Because on one hand, he knows that many gods require child sacrifice. And so now he sees that, oh my goodness, my God is going to require that of me. But at the same time, he's like, how could he ask me to do this when this is the promised child that he said he would use? And here, I guarantee you, Abraham is completely lost for words, because what he thought he understood about faith is very different than what he is being asked to do to follow God. And in the midst of this, he is decidingly going to respond. And he doesn't wait to put it off. If we start in verse 3, he says, "So Abraham arose early in the morning." In the original Hebrew, he was caused to arise early in the morning. And whether that is because maybe he didn't even sleep the night before, or maybe in the morning God was able to give them the encouragement to get up, what we got to see is that he didn't delay. He started off on this journey. He arose early. He saddled his donkey. More and less in that day, it wasn't a saddle like we think of it. He wrapped the donkey in like some cloth, and you got to have some straps to go over the cloth. So he rose up early in the morning, probably before even his wife was up in the morning, because he didn't want her to know what he was going to have to go do. And he wraps his donkey. Now, in my life, oftentimes, I've gone on some road trips, and usually you get an early start. To his son, to Isaac, in this moment, when his dad's waking him up and saying, "Son, we have to go." His son probably is like, "Okay, I've gone camping with Dad before." Typical. I mean, we go out and we worship God together on a regular basis. This isn't unusual. So Isaac gets up, not expecting anything different. Gets ready, and says, he took 2 of his young men, so these would be his servants. Abraham was a wealthy man. So he grabs Isaac, he grabs 2 young men to go with him, and they head out. And after they left the house, it says he cut wood for the burnt offering, which is interesting because he waited to cut wood till after they left the house. Because if you start cutting wood at the house, Sarai might have asked it, "Hey, what's going on?" His wife would have been maybe curious about this. And so they wait until afterwards when they cut the wood. And they arose and went to the place which God had told him. Now, from where they were living to this land of Moriah, it was about a 45-mile trek. I don't know if any of you have ever been backpacking before, but I mean, there's almost a similar thing here where you're going along, spending all your days hiking, your nights camping, days hiking, nights camping, going along to get to this place that God was going to show them. What's interesting for us today, looking back, is that this land of Moriah is the same place that we find Solomon decided to build his temple on the Mount of Moriah. This land of Moriah is what would eventually be known as Jerusalem. Years later. There's nothing there now, it was mountains. But Abraham took his kid on a 3-day trip to find this place to sacrifice. And there's one thing that's got to be nagging at Isaac along the way. Because here they're going on this 3-day trip, and he knows it's to sacrifice. But what do you sacrifice? You sacrifice the best of your possession. So, in their case, livestock. They would have taken the best lamb, the unblemished lamb in their herd, to go sacrifice. But as they're leaving, Isaac's like, "We didn't bring any lamb for sacrifice." And he's got to be wondering about this, because as they're going, they're like, he must be thinking, how come We don't have a lamb. Isaac at this point is estimated to be in his teenage years. Maybe as young as 12, maybe as old as 20, 25 maybe. Most likely, though, around, say, 16 or 17. He's not a dumb kid. He realizes that something's up when they're on this journey for 3 days, and Abraham didn't bring anything to sacrifice. And they're going on this journey, and I guarantee you, while Isaac's worrying about that, Abraham's thinking about the son he's about to have to give up. He's thinking about the day that Isaac was born. About the reason that they even named him Laughter. Maybe Isaac was a really cheerful baby. He brought laughter in their lives. Abraham as a father, he's thinking about watching his son's first steps. And at this point, he's going down memory lane, thinking about the first time him and his son played catch, Didn't have balls, so they probably used something like hardened donkey poop or something. I don't know. But there's great memories that Abraham had with Isaac, and he's getting to the point where he realizes he's going to have to let go of Isaac. Because although he doesn't see God's big picture, what he does see is what God has called him to do right now. And they're walking on this journey. After 3 days, they see the place from afar. And Abraham stops everyone, because there's the 2 other men he brought, and he says to them, "Hey, I need you two to stay here with the donkey. That way you guys can relax, He's trying to make it easy for these 2 young men. He's like, it's for your own good. You can relax here. Me and my son will go on further, and then we'll worship, and then we'll come back." And he's trying to make it so that they aren't going to see what's about to happen. And so these young men decide, we're going to stay here. The donkey was there to carry the wood, but since they were staying here with the donkey, Abraham takes the wood, and they strap it to Isaac's back because he's going to carry the wood. And Abraham and Isaac go up the mountain together to find this place where they're going to worship. And then looking in verse 6, we see that Abraham, after he took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so they went, both of them together. And as they're climbing the mountain, Isaac can't handle it anymore, because he's been building up this question for the past 3 days. And it finally comes out and he says, "My father, here I am." And he's trying to express this deep feeling towards Abraham. And Abraham says, "Here I am, son." And I guarantee that his voice has the utmost tenderness, Abraham, for his son right here. And Isaac says, "Behold, the fire, the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" He finally comes to it. We have the wood, we have the fire, we are missing an ingredient. That's awkward. We have the wood, we have the fire, but we're missing an ingredient. We're missing the lamb for this burnt offering. And Abraham, he's taken back. And there's an awkwardness. Because he has to, what do you say to this situation? Abraham does what he can. He says, God will provide for himself the lamb. In the original Hebrew it says, God will see it for himself, the lamb. And it's kind of an awkward phrasing, but I have a hard time feeling that he's trying to beat around the bush here. And he says, for the burnt offering, my son. So they kept going. And Isaac's got this thing, all right, God's going to provide the offering? I don't see how that's going to happen. And they get to the top. And when they came to the place in which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order. He builds the altar, he lays the wood. And then it comes time, and he binds Isaac. And lays Isaac, his son, on top of the altar on the wood. And here it comes, the moment he's going to have to slaughter his kid. The same way they slaughter livestock. And he takes the knife, and he rises it because he needs to slit Isaac's throat. And he takes the knife in his hand, and it says here, reaches out his hand, he took the knife to slaughter his son, and right when he's about to do it, God calls out to him from heaven and says, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham says, here I am. And God says, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I know that you fear God, seeing that you would not withhold your son, your only son, from me. Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught up in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered up this ram as the burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So at this great moment of tension, and he's about to kill Isaac, God stops him. And God provides a sacrifice for him. It's kind of crazy that we look at the story from our perspective, and although we know that it's going to come out okay, Abraham didn't. He had no clue how this was going to turn out. In the New Testament, it said Abraham maybe believed that God could raise his son from the dead or something to try and make things okay, but all he knew was that God promised him that his line would continue through Isaac, but then also God commanded him to do something he didn't understand. And what did Abraham do? Is that even in the midst of his doubt and uncertainty, he followed through in faith. God doesn't always show us our end destination. He doesn't. But he's still calling us to trust him with the now, even when it doesn't make sense. What dreams do you guys have? Isaac represented all of Abraham's hopes and dreams in the future. What dreams do you have a hard time giving to God in your life? Maybe you have an idea of where you're supposed to go to college, and that's a dream that you want to keep in your control. Maybe you have a certain job you want to do someday, and nothing is going to deter you from getting to that job someday. Maybe in 15 years or so, you want to start a family, and your goal in life is to get there to the place where you have that family and that job. Maybe someday you just want a really cool dog. I do. But oftentimes, we're too afraid of giving away what we want to have. We claim it for ourselves because we don't believe that God will provide with something even better. And that's our fear. That's why we don't surrender our lives completely to God's calling, isn't it? Because we're afraid if we give him everything, that he's going to keep it. And we don't trust that what God gives us in return is going to be as good as the thing that we want the most for ourselves. We want to believe that God has what's best for us, but we don't want to hand him the steering wheel to our lives. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor who died in a concentration camp during World War II. Before he died, he gave a sermon, and he put it this way. He said, "Can you believe in such a way that your whole life becomes or will become one great act of trusting God, of daring to believe in God? How often are we terrified by our own lack of faith? Only if only I could believe." At the bedsides of those who are sick and dying, at the edge of despair over myself and others, this cry rises up in me. Oh, if only I could believe. It is often a struggle for us to come to the place where we truly believe God's call is what's best for us. And Abraham must have been distraught, wondering how on earth God could call him to sacrifice his son. But on that mountain, a lot more happened, because what we see is that God never asked Abraham for something that God himself was not willing to give. When God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, he said, "Sacrifice Isaac, your only son, the son whom you love." Well, these are the same words used to describe God's son, Jesus. Jesus, his only son, his begotten son, the son whom God loves. He came to this earth to be a sacrifice. And in the same region, in Jerusalem, right near where Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac on the mountain, Jesus had to climb a mountain carrying wood on his back of what would kill him. And Jesus, with the wood on his back, gets to the top. But instead of God providing a way out, Jesus was the provision for everyone. He is the one who replaced all of us. All sinners had been replaced by Jesus as our provision. It was ironic when Abraham said to Isaac, God will provide the lamb for the offering. Because what we see is that God didn't provide a lamb. He provided a ram because the lamb was still to come. Jesus is the lamb that God promised to provide. And just as that ram took the place of Isaac, Jesus, our lamb, took the place of us. We hoard away what we're uncertain to give to God because we have this hard time believing that He has what is best for us. And here's the thing. One thing we can learn when we look at Abraham is that this is how God showed that he was different than all those idols that Abraham saw in the land. Abraham saw idol after idol not care that children were being sacrificed to them. And God showed that He was different. He wasn't the God who would sit by just to receive the obedience. And instead, our God is the God who provides. When none of those idols could ever provide for the people sacrificing them, our God provided. And He still provides for us. And how is it that we can't trust God with the plan of our lives when we look at how much He's already given for our lives? He calls us to live in a way that acknowledges that He gives what is great. And we see that He gives what is great through Jesus. I think it's time for us to take our hopes and dreams that we've been saving for ourselves, and we need to stop letting them. Stop letting our dreams, stop letting our desires hoard our life away from God. And we have to trust God to provide. During World War II, the Japanese conquered and occupied Korea. It was here in Korea that a woman named Esther Ann Kim lived. She was a Christian, and she refused to bow down at the shrines set up at every corner of her country. By refusing, she was breaking the law. She was in the midst of choosing between her life, her goals and dreams, or God's calling. And she decided to choose God's calling over anything she could have wanted. And she knew that it was only a matter of time before she'd be sent to prison. So she readied herself for it. She knew the food was going to be this rotten, disgusting food that they would try and drive her insane with. So months before she was even sent to prison, she started eating out of dumpsters and getting used to rotten food. She knew she'd never have a Bible in those prison walls. So she started memorizing God's words, hundreds of chapters of the Bible, so that she would have His Word with her in that prison. She memorized hymns that she'd be able to sing in that prison when all hope seemed lost. She eventually was caught, and she was sent to prison. And she stayed there for 6 years. And in the midst of that prison, God used her in countless ways. There was a Chinese woman who was sent to this prison, convicted of killing her husband. She wasn't cleaned up. She was thrown in a tiny cell. She was covered in her own feces. She was sick. Esther was able to be in the cell next to her, was able to care for her. Esther gave up her portions of food for 3 weeks to make sure that this woman could be nursed back to health. And she was only one example of the many lives that Esther touched in prison. And although that woman was convicted and eventually was executed, she was executed a believer in Christ and saved in her death. Even the jailers of Esther's prison saw the hope that lived within her. And I tell you this because Esther gave up everything she had. She sacrificed all of her hopes, all of her dreams, everything that was her goal in life for the promise that God would provide for her. And even though we can say, goodness, that would have been crappy provision, being stuck in a prison, she was used there, and I guarantee you her rewards in heaven are greater than we could imagine. God did provide. And we need to understand that He can provide with us something far richer than we could ever hope to accomplish on our own if we're willing to sacrifice our dreams for that. We need to stop letting our dreams and desires hoard away our lives from God. And we need to learn to trust His provision. Dear God, thank you so much that we could be here today and hear about your story. Hear about Isaac and how you called him to live his life. And we thank you also for Jesus, the one who would provide his life for us. And we thank you that Jesus, the true Lamb, was sacrificed, God, and that you didn't withhold your Son from the slaughter so that we could be provided for, so that our lives would be taken care of, God. I just pray that we are able to today acknowledge that you give greater things than we could ever hope for if we're willing to sacrifice our desires for you. I pray that each of us this week could spend time in prayer asking ourselves how we can start giving and sacrificing our dreams and desires daily so that you can have it all and that we could have trust and faith in you and your word. In your powerful name we pray. Amen.